We seem to be on the brink of World War III. The United States has launched another illegal attack on a sovereign nation and is now threatening the world's second largest superpower to a showdown with consequences that could spell the destruction of everything we hold dear. Now, I know this sounds like hyperbole and fear-mongering, and I ask that you forgive me for that because it's not my intention to frighten you, but rather state the situation as it's being delivered to us via most sources. The world seems paused on the brink of destruction, and nearly everyone is waiting with bated breath for what the next move will be from these two colossal actors. First it was Trump's attack, then Putin's response. Now Putin has responded, and we wait for Trump's return. You know, I can't help shake the feeling that we are all being forced in so many ways to resemble those, dare I say it, rather low IQ viewers of professional wrestling at the moment. Those who, being so wrapped up in the sound and fury and costumes and flames, the stories and fake rivalries and alliances, forget that they are, in the end, being entertained. That the entire ring, as it were, is but a stage, and that all the participants are actors. I know. Your initial response is likely one that sounds something like, "Oh, but John, the wrestling match doesn't threaten to end the world in nuclear hellfire." And that's true. I draw the comparison not so much as to what their outcomes have in similarity as to what their model and formula have in common. It's not an original comparison by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm not claiming to be the originator here of something new. But I think it's important that we look objectively from far enough back at just what is taking place on the global stage, in the global ring, as it were. And I don't see many people talking about this, at least not yet, as most seem to be so engrossed in the back and forth between these two titans. We find ourselves in a similar place, in a lot of ways, as that of those people who lived nearly 100 years ago, seemingly caught between the monolithic powers of the state that seems hell-bent on killing as many of us as need be to regain legitimacy and control over their populations. Those who, as knowledge and information spread increasingly, realize that the state and all its feeders are less and less relevant to the functioning and operation of a comfortable and well-lived life. In fact, it is the state that poses the biggest obstacles to that in almost every way now, more so than ever. Looking around on the surface, the players have all changed their costumes, their backstories have evolved, and their theatrics have as well. The stage has even evolved to accommodate their new toys and stories and costumes. And taking a cursory glance, you'd be forgiven for assuming that the position we find ourselves in now is one that is totally and completely unique and novel. But, as has been stated before, and apparently bears repeating now more than ever, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And friends, we seem, en masse, to be struck with a serious case of amnesia. Take those who supported Trump, for example. The Hope and Change 2.0 candidate, riding a wave of political rhetoric that appealed to the sentiments of the masses, he convinced the formerly disgruntled American populace and much of the world to lull itself back to sleep. Those who had become jaded by the 8 years of the charlatan of Hope and Change 1.0 were blinded by the vanilla version of the same, what was it he said? Okey doke, as Hussein put it. Duped into believing that anything a politician says while campaigning is true. Then there are those who, riding this wave of populist rhetoric, sought to gain wealth and popularity by selling their wares and hawking their goods and feeding the people what they wanted to hear instead of telling them what they needed to hear, instead of reminding them of our not-so-distant past and shaking off the shackles of amnesia being laced around their necks. They encouraged them to tighten them. They encouraged them to pull the wool over their eyes. Well, they are now, of course, in light of the veil being lifted rather abruptly by the Commander-in-Chief himself, seeking to regain the confidence and respect of those who, being shocked that they were yet again lied to, are now beginning to realize slowly what has actually taken place. They are beginning to remember. I ask you, friends, do not fall for their lies again. Remember, and remember well, the part these snake oil salesmen played in all this. Those who saw an opportunity to prey on your hopes and wishes, to make money and gain prestige and popularity, and to gain your support and attention, are not your friends. They do not have your best interests in mind. But I digress. We seem to have allowed ourselves to forget the lessons history has taught us. Perhaps for some, they never learned them or read about them. And surely the government-run schools will do little to ensure you are educated about its past mistakes, if we can even call them that. So many seem to have bought into the wrestling match without so much as questioning, is it real? Are these titans really at war with one another, or is the real enemy closer to home? You see, the only threat to the power of America's ruling class is the same threat to the power of Russia's ruling class. And the same can be said for every other state which possesses a ruling class. Chiefly, that threat comes from those people who are waking up to the fact that governments and states and all of their feeders are outdated models for organizing human interaction. Those people around the world realizing that central banks owned and operated by certain groups of people, foreign interests and hand-wringing kleptocrats, employing subversive and destructive tactics to slow, degrade, and destroy the families, friendships, and bonds of trust that would normally serve as the glue of the nations. These people are the greatest threat to their control and continued existence. Not the government in Moscow, or the government in D.C., or any other government in some far-off capital. They have more in common with each other than they would ever have in common with you or those with whom you associate. A brief glance at the capitals and government buildings of each of the states will demonstrate the similarities in their costumes and gibes. A look at their officials and police forces, their militaries and their money, all the tools they utilize to control their people, have more in common with one another than the people do with those who rule over them. In fact, if not for their flags and badges, in most cases, you could never tell them apart. You won't be surprised to discover that their means of extraditing that control is also similar. Their chief tool being fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the alien other, fear of terror, fear of war, fear of being poor, fear of dying, fear of ill health. Fear, fear, fear is their number one tool, and all states utilize it. We have all managed to allow them to set the pace of our growth and development. We have concerned ourselves with their arbitrary rules, laws, and regulations for countless years, marching to our deaths at their command, making them fat on our labor and our ideas, on the inventions that entrepreneurs and men and women of science create, allowing them to take what was once going to be used to better mankind and to turn it against the very people they claim to protect. From the surveillance state to the false wars on terror, to the eroding of our health and the safety of our food supplies. Every technology the state gets its hands on or puts its money and power behind eventually lead to a net negative for the people whose back the state stands erect upon. I think it's time we showed the state that we remember, that we see the lessons of our past, and that we will not allow them to rush headlong into another staged knockout that will see our mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters, family and friends hurting or dying, fighting and crying, all so they can continue to rule at our detriment. If it's one thing we can all agree on, whether you be a Democrat or a Republican, an alt-righter, a libertarian, an anarchist, what have you, none of us seek to gain from the potential coup de grace of this wrestling match. Out the other side will not be greater freedom and liberty, and all things good for humanity. Out the other side will come only more of the same, if we allow history to repeat, that is. Thanks for having a look and a listen, my friends, and until next time, take care and have no fear. Fear is the mind killer.